please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is the approval of the agenda. Pleasure of the committee.
Motion to approve.
Motion by Mr. Fiorillo, second by Mr. DeMonica. Any further discussion? All those in favor? Those opposed? And that motion carries 6-0. And note for the record, Mr. Salvatore is absent this evening. Next item on the agenda is the consent agenda. We have minutes from regular meeting 1/28/2016, executive session 1/28/2016, enrollment report from February 1st, school police report from January 1st, and residency truancy report from February 1st. Pleasure of the committee on the consent agenda.
Madam Chair, make a motion to approve.
Motion by Mr. DeMonica, second by Mr. Fiorillo. Any further discussion? All those in favor? Those opposed? That motion carries 6-0. Next item on the agenda is report out of executive session meeting. There were no votes taken this evening, and I need a vote to seal the minutes of the executive session. Motion by Mrs. Teal, second by Mr. Fiorillo. Any further discussion? All those in favor? Any opposed? That motion carries 6-0. Next item on the agenda is the superintendent's report. Mr. DeMonica, we have you here this evening to provide a few updates.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yes.
I do want to talk a little bit about our upcoming professional development days next week, next Tuesday and Wednesday. Our teachers across the district, staff, will be involved in some great professional development opportunities. Among them are Thinking Maps, which is an initiative that Bob Mitchell, superintendent, brought to Cumberland. We'll be continuing with that training. We're also going to be having some SRSD training, which Dr. Laud has brought to Cumberland with some of our 5th and 6th grade teachers. We're also going to be starting a curriculum mapping initiative in the district, and this is something that I find is going to be a significant piece to our academic identity and growth moving forward as a district. There are 3 big objectives to curriculum mapping that the teachers will be involved in. And the first objective is it's an in-depth analysis of our curriculum to identify gaps and plan for improvements. The second main objective is to systemize sort of an ongoing process in curricular revision in the district. We want to systemize that. We want to make that a common practice in what we do. And the third objective is that we have a quick and efficient way to access curriculum pre-K through 12, regardless of content. We want to have one platform, and Mike Chandler's been helping us work on that platform where it's transparent for all parents, students, teachers to have access to this information in a very efficient way. Again, so that we can look at the scope of our curriculum very, very quickly. So those are the 3 main objectives of curriculum mapping that we're excited about. Dr. Santa has also been instrumental in helping us differentiate with all of our other subgroups, nurses, speech pathologists, special educators. They're all getting differentiated professional development. So we're really excited about that. I know at the high school level as well, they have a differentiated model, which is pretty amazing. A lot of self-directed professional development in setting their own goals. Which is highly impressive. So that's the scope of my report on PD. Thank you.
Any questions? So I have a question about curriculum mapping. Does it allow you to, for students who are academically talented in a content area, allow them to move forward maybe more quickly through the curriculum if they're really ready for it? Or is that not kind of
It's
where...
not really. Mapping is more about understanding what it is that we're teaching and assessing right now. So it gives us a real understanding of how in-depth we're going into the standards. Are we assessing what we think we're assessing and measuring? And having us really look at our curriculum as it pertains to proficiency, which is what we'll be talking about in a little while with the PARC assessment. So.
Good. All right, thank you. Anyone else? All right, moving on. Chairperson's report, school-town collaborations. I did see that the Valley Breeze had some nice information about our you, Mrs. Green. And I do think we'll probably get a little task force update on the appropriate agenda items, so I will wait till then. Next item on the agenda is reports of standing committees, payment of bills. Mr. DeMonica.
Madam Chair, the Finance Subcommittee did meet tonight, and we had some discussions over the payment of the bills, and I would make a motion that we approve the payment of the bills of $1,889,815.86, and that passed in our committee 3-0.
Mr. DeMonica moves passage of the payment of bills. Do I have a second? Second by Mr. Denon. Do I have any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? And that motion carries 6-0. Next item is fiscal management subcommittee update.
Madam Chair, we did have some lively discussion with the business manager tonight about the January budget statement at this time. There were certainly some questions about technology, literacy reimbursement, and educational supplies that the business manager would like to carry into next year, so that'll be something we'll be discussing further. Because we do want to make sure that we spend the money that we need to spend on our children. Right now, the healthcare has changed again. It has gone from previous year. The projected loss was, last month was $710,616. This time it's $706,668. So it is still projected loss. Mr. Pignano talked to us about there was a possible bill from Blue Cross. They think they may cover it. They're not sure. It's a $300,000 prescription bill. I'm not sure if stopgap insurance will cover it yet, but that's something that he is keeping a very close eye on that figure.
So is that included in this
That is
706?
not included with this figure at this time. So we have the report that Mr. Pignano is projecting if we didn't spend this technology reimbursement of educational supplies, we're looking at about a $460,000 projected surplus, but once you add those numbers in as well, it would be higher, so it's something that we're going to talk about some more. That was one of the items we talked about, buying new science projectors, some transfers in regards to special ed services because we're going to need to do some more testing, and then Mr. Neves came in from Durham, and we talked about the bus routes, and that's something he's going to bring us back some more information because a lot of buses maybe have 10, 12 kids, and they're figuring out 80 kids on a bus, and you have 15 kids on it. So we have a problem that we may be able to do something down the road, whether it's depots or something, but we need to take a look at the busing because people are complaining they're going out and nothing. And there's a reason why. They're going to get us the numbers and the routes to take a closer look at that. And Sedesco gave us a new report, and we're about $40,000 ahead from the last one. So profit-wise, the school district is running at $152,000 right now so far, but she also gave us a report, we're about $17,000 in the hole in regards to providing lunch to not only our children, but BVP and so forth. And they're working with the principals now to get the letters out to tell the parents they need to pay up, but,
So those are for overdue payments.
overdue BVP alone was over $7,000. So we need to get them collecting that money. So that's the report from the finance.
Thank you. Next item is policy and procedures subcommittee update. Mr. Fiorello?
Yes, policy did not meet this past week, or this past Tuesday. We will meet in 2 weeks, and I expect that the transgender policy that we're working on will be back on the agenda.
Thank you. And Mrs. Teal, achievement and communications subcommittee.
Thank you. Achievement and communications also did not meet. We'll be meeting again in 2 weeks. And we're going to follow up on the information that was provided to us by the schools to look at what they identified as their needs and some common themes across all the schools in the district. Thank you.
What would also be interesting is we'll talk a little bit about PARC tonight, so a little bit about assessment scores, is to try and find a way to dashboard the district. So it may be things related to achievement, but it also may be things related to gaps that we've identified, like with mental health support, service and support that we can use kind of moving forward around how do we address those gaps. Thank you. And Mr. Duffy, Budget Task Force update.
Yes, we met on February 2nd, and the group of community volunteers put together a PowerPoint presentation that covers, I'll give you the rough overview. They covered what is our vision, where we are, what our problems are, the financials between the school and the town, who the stakeholders actually are as part of this, collaboration ideas, revenue opportunities, cost savings, shared service opportunities, return on investment, where they linked the home value to actually the schools, good schools, as far as, yes, if the taxes went up, it may cost you X dollars, but with poor schools, you lose X number of dollars on your home value itself, and it's actually a better return on investment with the increase in taxes going into fund a better school system because you're not losing value in your home itself. So they did a real good breakdown on that. So where we are with this right now is we're meeting again. Next meeting is February 18th. I believe it's a Thursday. And we've taken this presentation and other people on the task force, such as Jeremy from Blackstone Valley Prep, Town Council and the Mayor, myself, and we're going to go through the minutes and any other ideas along this as far as collaboration and possible revenue sources. We're going to put all this together. And the group of community volunteers who stepped forward, they have agreed that what we're trying to do is the next steps. What are we going to do with this report when we're done? So we're going to discuss that at the next meeting, but the initial thoughts from the group is they will take this presentation and come to the school committee and give the full presentation to the full school committee, to the town council, or it could potentially be when the town council and school committee meet for the joint meeting, that may possibly they could give that there. And they're also evaluating other stakeholders in town that they could also bring this presentation to, whether it be business owners, hold a forum for the community, but they're looking into. But this task force, so the group that was put together of the community volunteers, they feel that this is just the beginning of this process. Once they work this up, this is step one. It doesn't just end with them producing a report, but they'd really like to try to get this information out. They would like to get it out at the state level, to invite the state reps and the state senators in as well, so that they have a good understanding of what's going on, possibly RIDE and whoever else. So the next meeting is really going to be more of an organizational meeting on putting the fine touches on this. And we also have the school department is also working on taking roughing some of the edges off of this, I guess, to make it so if the presentation is going to the town, in the end, it's like, this is what you need to look at. If it's going to the state level, this is what we need you to look at. If it's going to the school, this is what we need you to look at. So that you can see the entire product, but if there's certain things that they feel that the school committee should look at, that this is your list of items they think that you could possibly look at for revenue sources or collaboration and that sort of stuff. So it should be a pretty comprehensive, I'll say, report or presentation when we're all done. We hope to have that wrapped up on the 18th, at least to then kick off what we're going to do with it. So I hope that clarifies a little. But I don't want to go through the full report because it's, again, I would prefer to have them present it because they did such a good job.
When you do create the report, can you be certain that they cite any evidence? So I think the real estate property value piece is critical. And it's great if somebody says, well, we know there's a connection, but can we prove that there's a connection through other sort of research entities?
Okay, I will ensure that, yes.
That would be really helpful. And my recollection is we typically have our joint meeting with the town between February and March. So maybe we'll push it a little more toward the March timeframe, just to give your task force the opportunity to wrap up their work.
So I'll check with the group if you want to work the dates out. I think that if you're okay with that, if you can check with the town, if they're okay with doing that presentation, one group meeting. Yep. I'm sure that the volunteers, it would work for them to have one meeting as opposed to multiple meetings as well.
Okay, I'll take that information. Thank you, Mr. Duffy. Next item on the agenda is comments from the public. Anyone here wish to speak this evening? Brady, are you here for comments for the public?
Yes, I don't know if it's in regards to the school calendar, so I don't know if it would be more appropriate to say it at the time that you're talking about that, or now would be the time?
Now's the perfect time. Yep.
Okay, I just want to speak on behalf of myself and the other faculty members that to parents that work in fields other than education, having a vacation in April, having it in March, having it in February doesn't necessarily make as much of an impact as it does for those of us that work for the school department, especially if we have children in other school districts who have vacations at specific times. If you're working in another profession, you could say, you have to find childcare, and you do. You have 180 days that are covered by the school department. For those of us that work in education, it's a package deal. We choose to stay in education, chose to get into education because of some of these things that allow us time with our families during vacations, during the summer, things like that. So please take those of us that are parents into consideration that work for the school department, and there are quite a few of us that have children in other districts and other states that have different vacation times. And if you start messing with the calendar in contradiction to what's going on in other places in the state, that really provides an inconvenience for us. But more importantly, as a parent of a child with special needs, it really, I can't remain silent on the issue of extending summer and taking away break time during the school year. If this were my son, and I don't have children in Cumberland schools, but as a parent of a child who needs that break and needs that vacation, and who recoupment and retention over the course of the summer is a humongous issue for, I can't imagine being a parent of a child in Cumberland and taking away a February vacation, creating a 12 to 14 week break with no vacation between March and June, and then for the sake of shortening the school year, so that you have extra time that you then have to recoup and recover from in the summertime. I just think it's short-sighted. I think we're trying to change things that don't necessarily need to be changed. And in fact, I take it one step forward and say, please give us back our February vacation. But I feel very strongly, and preserving my right to complain about whatever happens in the future, I can't complain about it if I don't come up here and say, this is how I feel. So thank you for listening.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Hearing none. Next item on the agenda is a vote on teacher non-renewal dismissal recommendations. So Mrs. Fogel, we were presented in executive session with 93 non-renewals. Mrs. Teal?
Motion I'd like to make regarding renewal.
Sure thing.
I'd like to make a motion that the committee found that all of the teachers who appeared on the list presented by Mrs. Fogel are in fact non-tenured. That would be the list of recommendations for non-renewal.
So Mrs. Teal has made a motion. Do I have a second? Second by Mr. Fiorello. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? And that motion carries 6-0.
I'd like to make a motion to approve the recommendations for non-renewal as presented by Mrs. Vogel during executive session.
Motion by Mrs. Teal, second by Mr. Fiorello.
There are 93 names on it.
There are 93. Thank you. Any further discussion? All those in favor? Those opposed? And that motion carries 6-0. Thank you. Next item, discussion and/or vote to approve overnight student field trip, CHS Spain and Portugal, and then we have CHS France. Ladies. Ciao and bonjour.
We're here.
Yes.
And I must say, I've had the pleasure of teaching 3 of your children.
Yes.
It was my delight.
Good evening, I'm Isabel Claro, and I teach Portuguese and Spanish here at Cumberland High School. And I'm seeking approval for my Spain and Portugal trip, April vacation of this year. We're leaving on Friday the 15th in the evening and returning on Saturday the 23rd. We'll be visiting Madrid, Toledo, and the university city of Salamanca in Spain. And then we proceed into Portugal, and we'll be visiting, I'm not sure if you're aware that Cumberland has a sister city in Portugal, happens to be my heritage town, Penalva do Castelo. We'll be visiting there for about a day and a half, and we'll be hosted by the mayor in the town hall. We'll be visiting the high school, probably having lunch there, I'm sure. It's all about the food in Portugal. We'll be also, Penalva is well known for their cheese industry and their wine industry. So we'll be visiting the cheese factory and the winery and seeing how the cheese is made and how wine is produced. And then we move on to Coimbra, which is the university city of Portugal as well, one of the oldest universities of Europe. And from there we move on to Fatima and end up in Lisbon for about a day and a half. While in Spain we have a tapas dinner, which the kids always look forward to, they get to dress up. And in Lisbon we have a fado night. Fado is equivalent to the American blues. We'll have a very fancy dinner at the end of the trip in Lisbon. It's a very rewarding trip. This is my 5th trip as a leader. I've also chaperoned 3 of the France trips, and they're always amazing. The kids come back with such an experience, and it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. They get to be exposed to the culture, the traditions, the architecture, the amazing views. They get to use the language that they learn about in class. So I'm hoping that will be a trip for me. Any questions?
Questions? Mr. DeMonica?
Just one, at the winery, no samplings.
I'm sorry?
At the winery, no samplings.
No samplings.
And I'm seeking approval for my trip to Paris and Normandy. Mrs. Bolio's son is actually traveling with me. We do all the sites in Paris, and then we head up to Normandy and integrate all the World War II history, the D-Day beaches. We go to the American Cemetery, the museums up there. And actually that, I believe, from talking to the kids after, is the most rewarding part, because it's very moving for them, and they see the connection. There's always a connection. I actually have had students who've gone to see relatives who are buried in the American cemetery there. We have somebody, Sohail Abatal, actually, his grandfather landed in D-Day, the D-Day landings, and so it's going to be very moving for him. He's coming with us. And it's the same thing. There's nothing like the experience of taking a student, just the worldly experience of taking them out of the country and making them, they become so much more independent, and just they all of a sudden have this thirst to become part of the world. So no matter where it is, it's the best experience you can possibly give a student, better than any education we can give them in the classroom.
I remember, on my 2008 trip, one of the things that I do on the last day, we hang out in the lobby of the hotel, and we reflect on the week. And I usually ask them, what was your favorite part of the trip? And many times they say it was my hometown. They just love the little town feeling and visiting with students their age, and etc. And I remember one student as well, he said to me, Mrs. Farrell, we came here as classmates, but we're leaving as a family. And that was so touching, and I thought that was, to me, that was just totally worth it. Totally worth the time.
And I think if I were to go back over the years of students I've taken, I would say probably 95% of them have gone on in college to study abroad and to keep up their language in college and have it as either a minor or a double major. So, and I know Mrs. Steele, you know the value of the international education. So, yes, I'm seeking approval too, please.
Mr. Duffy?
Just one question on the France trip. They're still under a state of emergency, I believe, over there until the end of February. Does that have any effect on the trip if that's extended, or what's the procedure with that?
If it's an extended, if it's issued by our State Department, which right now it's actually not our State Department who has issued it, it's France is in a protected state still. Since 9/11 there was a clause built into insurance that if there is a state of emergency, students will get all their money besides the insurance back.
That's that there was a state of emergency declared by the United States or by the country you're going to?
Yes, but I don't think the United States will issue one if France has issued one. I believe.
So, but I'm just confused then, because I thought that they were still under a state of emergency at this time in France until the end of February.
There's no travel restriction.
No travel, okay,
Yeah.
that's what you were talking
Yeah,
about.
there's no travel restriction.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else? So this is for this coming April?
Yes.
Typically, don't we do this much farther out?
I've never, my last trip was in 2012, and I actually never had to come from the school committee before, which is fine, but I always planned the whole trip.
I know.
I always had the students sign up and then seek approval from the superintendent.
Yeah, I mean, so the thing about having students sign up early is normally when I get back in April, I start sign-ups for my next trip because they can lock in at such a cheaper price. And so at that stage, we don't even know the calendar so to seek approval when we don't calendar for 2 years out or.
Yeah, I know there's some trips that are much farther out in their planning. And so I was just a little surprised to see.
We're very planned, we've planned and organized a lot. We're very organized.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe we can work with Mr. Mitchell just to make certain that we're doing it kind of at the right time so
Yeah,
that we don't see
In fact, he
any.
talked to me about that as well.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so we'll get a little schedule going. Any other questions? Do you want to do this one by one or all together? Okay.
I'll make a motion to approve both overnight student field trips.
Motion by Mr. Fiorello to approve both the Spain and Portugal and the France trip. Second by Mr. Denon. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? That motion carries 6-0.
Thank you.
Enjoy. Thank you. Someday we'll get the school committee sponsored field trip. Next item on the agenda is discussion of 2016-2017 school calendar. So we have two calendars before us this evening. We don't have it as a vote, and we probably should combine item C and item D because we do have the survey results. So maybe we can go over the survey and there may be some additional questions, comments, concerns, some feedback from the committee. And then I would imagine, because I don't see it further down, we would do a vote at the next meeting. Sound good with everyone? Okay, so gentlemen, I do think we have a presentation. And you should have it on your drives. And Mr. D'Amato, I don't know if you want to walk through this on your own or with me, or we can... Sure thing. Okay, so just to give a little background, we sent this survey out last Friday. Based on some input from school committee. I know Mr. Demotic had said, let's get some information out. And then during the meeting, what was acknowledged was we could do a survey kind of rather quickly to get some information to help us make our decisions. So it was sent out on a Friday, and I think the survey closed on Tuesday or Wednesday. And that'll kind of allow us to segue into this. All right, Mr. Demotic.
Sure. So the survey that we put out, we received 1,647 total responses. We had participation from all of our school communities, including the preschool. And as you can see up on the board, the different percentages of participation rates. But the total number of participants was quite good in terms of responses. The next slide talks about moving the traditional April vacation to March beginning in 2017, and it breaks it down by whether they strongly agree, no preference, and the actual summary of those results are actually on the next slide, where it shows approximately almost 59% of people, 50.5%, as opposed to the no, 41.5% of the population of the total responses. That includes, by the way, staff and parents, staff, teachers, and parents. So that's total number, 59% to about 42%. The next slide has a breakdown of parents only, and the parents only responses equated to 1,242 responses. Again, we see a roughly 60-40 split in the data from those responses. And then the survey goes on to break it down from teachers and staff. And there we see a closer response rate where it's 54% roughly in the yes to a 45.8% in the no.
And Mr. Demotta, just quickly, there's approximately how many staff, 700 or so, Mrs. Vogel, if we were to send this out?
I'm not, if it went out through district information, though, that would only be, I don't know that that's all, even including part-time employees, so I would say it went out to at least 565 full-time employees. I don't know if that included part-time or not.
Thank you.
So then in this slide, it talks a little bit about how participants perceive positive impacts as beneficial, move from eliminating April break to moving to mid-March. And as the data suggests, 42% say fewer interruptions in the school year are beneficial to learning. 42% say students would be more focused on learning. And then 37% of the participants say that there's more time in the summer for family. And the last portion of the survey addresses the biggest possible challenges by eliminating that April break and making it difficult. And we see that 51% say it's inconsistent with other school systems in Rhode Island. 25% say that students and staff need more than one break between January and June. 22% say it disrupts existing vacation plans. And then lastly, 20% say it disrupts existing childcare plans.
So at this point, does anyone have any specific questions that we need to provide as future resolutions? Mr. Dunn.
It's a real simple question. In the drive, there's a school calendar version 1B and version 2B. Are those exactly the same as what we got the last meeting? We don't.
I can't answer that, but I don't think anyone had made any changes.
Yeah, they
to
seem the same,
calendar.
so I just wondered why they were labeled B. That's all. Good.
Sorry, I couldn't answer that.
Yeah.
That's Mr. Mitchell.
Yeah, we hadn't had any changes to the calendar.
Right.
Any questions for Mr. Martin or Mr. Mitchell that we can forward? Yes, Mr. Duffy.
Just a question on the first page, which is survey audience. When it says Cumberland preschool 2.67%, what is that number? Is that the percentage of respondents from that individual school? So we only got 2% of attendance. Okay.
Right.
No, isn't it 2% of the whole?
Yeah.
At least from Eastman?
2%, 2.6, or whatever that number, percent of all the
All-
respondents were from the preschool.
2%, 16.
Okay. So do we know the percentage by individual school? I guess is what I would like to see. Like, did we get 80% response back from Cumberland High School, but only 5% from North Cumberland, as an example? Just to see what the penetration was. Did we reach the parents by the survey at each school?
Got it. Thank you. We can ask Justin to get that information for us.
Any other thoughts or commentary before we move on? No, Mr. DeMonico?
Commentary, I heard from many parents by email and phone saying that they were against the change from April to March. That it doesn't give them enough time for the next year coming up, because they've already made plans to change things. And so it would be something, some of them were willing to consider it 2 years from now, when they've had more time to make the plan.
Yeah, and I think what we've seen statewide is other districts have done that type of activity when they've moved their calendar. They've said, okay, for this school year, we're maintaining it as is, but the following school year, because we do want to acknowledge that people do have commitments that may have cost impact to them.
Would we, if and when we do take a vote, would we vote to amend it on the floor at that time, or have another schedule?
So what I think we would do is we would approve a school calendar for 16-17, but we could give Mr. Mitchell the direction that we would like for next year for him to model a calendar that has whatever the committee determines is the appropriate next step. So no matter what, we have to approve a calendar. for 16, 17, and then I would say after that, we would see what the consensus is on the committee on having an April versus a March. Mr. Duffy, Joe, something else?
So just to respond, that's what we did when we switched to the February. The year before we did it, we made it clear, next year you're gonna see a calendar that shows February being eliminated or reduced. That way we gave everyone almost that 18 months before we actually made the change. So if this was the direction we were gonna go in, I would anticipate the same type of a thing. So that the public knows and the teaching staff and all the employees understand that that's our intention to go that route. That doesn't mean that we could even vote that that's our intention, but there could be only more at that time and things could change, so. But we could certainly make that statement.
Okay. Thank you. Next item, discussion and/or vote to approve resolution SCPR 2016-02, high school science projector purchase. Mr. Demonica.
Madam Chair, we did meet tonight, excuse me. The committee voted 3-0 to purchase 15 new LCD projectors for the high school science wing. They're replacing the original ones that were there when the school was, when the new science building was built. We did have a little discussion about what we're going to do with the others. And we're going to have Mr. Chandler see if he can spread them around to the other schools that could use projectors. So we did pass this through this 3-0. It is budgeted in this year's technology budget. So it's a resolution authorizing and empowering the school committee to execute a purchase from Whaley Computer Associates of 9 Industrial Road, Milford, Mass. for the purchase and installation of 15 LCD projectors for the high school for an amount not to exceed $29,508.30, and I would move the passage.
Mr. Demonica moves passage of the resolution. Do I have a second? Second by Mr. Denon.
I just wanted to make a comment.
Sure thing.
These were budget.
Yes.
They came in, well, I'm not making a statement actually, that we talked about the fiscal meeting, they came in under budget too.
Thank you. And is the reason that we're upgrading them because they're just their life expectancy, or was there a general idea as to why we're replacing them?
I believe it's kind of a life expectancy of what was up there, and again, but we won't just throw them away, we'll reuse them somewhere.
Yeah.
Some of them will be able to be reused, some won't be able to.
Got it. So that's 2010 they were there, so they last about 5 or 6 years, does that sound about
Well,
right?
we've gone to a different type of projector, and the rest of the high school has this different projector.
short
We want
one.
the science wing to have the same.
Understood.
Some of them have already been replaced
Got it.
with
Thank you.
used ones.
Oh, well, that's practical, thank you. All right, so we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor? Those opposed? And that motion carries 6-0. Next item, discussion and or vote to approve resolution SCR 2016-01, fiscal 16 budget transfers for clinical services.
Madam Chair, that was discussed tonight upstairs on the 3-0 vote. The Finance Subcommittee pushed this forward for consideration. What this is a budget transfer of $6,000. It's going to decrease the special ed tuitions. Mr. Pagano says we're running a little bit good at this time. And we'll push $6,000 towards special ed purchase services, which I am told the special ed department needs to do some more clinical evaluations, and so this will allow them to continue doing what they need to do. So I would move passage, pass 3-0.
Thank you. So Mr. Demonica moves passage of the resolution, and do I have a second? Second by Mr. Denon and Mr. Fiorello. You guys try to time it so you go exactly the same time. Any further discussion? All those in favor? Those opposed? That motion carries 6-0. Next item on the agenda, discussion and or vote to approve resolution SCR 2016-02, naming of pool wing, the Bruce Calvert Pool. Mr. Fiorello, you had asked for this resolution.
Yes, I did. I've been contacted by many people in the community supporting the idea of supporting the town council's decision to try to name the pool after Mr. Calvert, who spent many years in the Cumberland School Department, as you all well know. So I thought it was only right to support that move. So I wrote a resolution. Go ahead and read the resolution.
Sure.
As soon as I find it. Oh, I went all the way back. One second. The resolution is sent to the Cumberland Town Council supporting an ordinance to name the Cumberland High School pool wing in honor of Bruce Calvert. Whereas Bruce Calvert was the Cumberland High School swim coach from 1974 to 2010, and whereas Mr. Calvert was inducted in the Rhode Island Aquatic Hall of Fame in 1987 and was also inducted into the Cumberland High School Athletic Hall of Fame in 2003, and whereas Mr. Calvert coached 5 student athletes to be named All-American and 90 student athletes to receive All-State honors, and whereas Mr. Calvert coached the Cumberland School swim team to 7 boys team, that's going to be rewritten, and 6 girl team state championships, and whereas Mr. Calvert taught his students many life lessons that will be used in and out of the pool during their lives, and whereas Mr. Calvert has earned the respect of the Cumberland community over the span of his 36 years with the Cumberland schools, and therefore be it resolved that the Cumberland School Committee supports the naming of the Cumberland High School pool wing in honor of Bruce Calvert.
Thank you. And are you moving passage of that resolution?
Yeah, just want to see this. Okay, yes, I read it incorrectly, but it's written well. Yes, I would make a motion to pass this resolution.
So the motion, do I have a second? Second by Mr. Denon. Any further discussion? Mrs. Steele?
Do you mind if I make a couple comments?
Sure.
Thank you. I greatly appreciate Mr. Calvert's contributions to the Cumberland school system and to the students, and he certainly was instrumental in basically saving the pool. But I can't support this resolution because I feel like there are, for a number of reasons. One, I don't think it's our responsibility, the school committee's responsibility to be naming our buildings. I also think that over time, there have been many teachers, many administrators, many janitors, many support staff. There's been numerous people that have devoted their entire working careers to the students of Cumberland, and I have a hard time sort of identifying one as being more worthy than another. And I also, I think it's great that we recognize these people, and I think there's probably more personal ways that we could do it with a hall of remembrance in our individual schools or by the administration. But or that there needs to be a process where names are brought forth, that maybe there's other people that would want buildings named after them, and what's the procedure or the process we have for selecting people that are so deserving. So while again, I greatly appreciate his commitment to the students, I don't think it's appropriate for us to do this specifically, not when we don't really have a procedure or an outline of how we want to do this for other individuals that could also be as deserving. So thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? So it's my understanding that it is not in the scope of our authority to do that, but at any point, a resolution could be brought forth for the committee to entertain. And while I wholeheartedly agree, Mrs. Teal, that when there's not a process, it does create a high risk for other problems in the future. I do think that Mr. Calvert has dedicated his career, and can we use this as an opportunity moving forward to create a means or a process by which that can occur more, what's the word, judiciously? So that, and we only have so much space, and we've had an awful lot of people who've been very instrumental in Cumberland, so I respect your opinion. Anyone else? Mr. Fiorillo?
Yeah, I agree with Mrs. Teal and yourself as well. I think this is just a very unique position because Mr. Calvert was a very small section of the properties, really, just the pool, and I doubt anyone else is going to have the impact Mr. Calvert has had the pool and the aquatics and the swim program in general.
Mr. Tennant?
I actually had Mr. Calvert as a teacher. I don't want to say which part of it, 1974 versus 2010, but it's somewhere in there. And when you thought of the pool, you thought of Mr. Calvert, and they were interchangeable during my years here. That's why I support it.
We're all set? Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? And that motion carries 5-1 with Mrs. Teal voting against. Thank you. Next item on the agenda is presentation on park assessments. Ready? Yes. Thank you.
Don't mind, Madam Chairman, to stand over there.
Absolutely. Yep. And it should be in our drive. Cindy put it in the drive today. So if you want to sit down in the seats, we can do that. Or if you want to load it up, hopefully by the end of the meeting, we'll find it. It's under new business.
I think, can everybody hear me? I can have use my PE voice, my gym voice this evening. So, good evening, everyone. This evening, I put together about 20 slides for everyone, and I did my best to synthesize and present the information in a way that's palatable and understandable, because there is a plethora of data out there that we can dig into and that's related to park data and information for our students. I'd just like to footnote that I used the RIDE EPSS system and their information support system to populate this data for the purposes of this presentation. The first slide I just thought it's a fitting way to begin, and it's a statement that I pulled right from RIDE that just outlines that park is this data set from 2014, 2015 just provides us with a first look at whether students are meeting expectations and new learning standards in both literacy and mathematics. So I just wanted to frame the presentation with that opening statement. Okay. The next slide is the performance level indicators that PARC uses to determine whether or not students have met expectations, exceeded expectations, whether they did not yet meet expectations. And NECAP had 4 levels. PARC has shifted to 5. And these are the 5 levels. Levels 1 through 5, level 1 meaning not meeting, 2 partially, 3 approached, 4 met, and 5 exceeded. And I believe that these levels are provided to parents on the actual PARC reports that go home along for the student. So I wanted to again share that. This next slide is also something that a parent would find on their child's report when it comes home, and I just thought it was relevant to share this. The scales typically range from, the scale score ranges from 650 to 850. The cut score on this particular example is 750, the cut score between meeting proficiency and approaching proficiency level, or meeting those grade level standards. In this particular example, the child score is a 739. If you look down, it also provides additional information on the bottom. It compares that child's scale score to school average. In this particular case, this child was equal to the PARC average score in this particular case. And the child received a level 3, which is that approaching status on this particular simple example. And I just wanted to provide that as just a snapshot of what a parent may see.
Can I ask a question about the
Sure.
cut scores? So the cut scores vary based on the grade?
Yes, they do. The cut scores do vary. It is not always 750. It varies by grade and content.
And does the state set the cut score, or is it set nationally?
That's a great question. I think, I can't accurately answer that question. I can find that out for you. But I would guess that it would be nationally, I would guess.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
It's important to understand that in both literacy and math, there are components to the actual assessment. So I wanted to break down the components in both literacy and mathematics for you. The 5 areas in literacy, English language arts, there are reading and writing components, literary text, informational text, vocabulary, written expression, and knowledge and use of language conventions. And these subparts, a student actually receives a score in each of these categories. On the next slide, I actually show a mathematics example of that. So in math, English language arts, you see 5 components. In math, there are 4 performance indicators: major content, expressing mathematical reasoning, additional and supporting content, and modeling application. And what these arrows indicate to a parent is how that particular child did in that particular area, whether they were below expectations, whether they met the expectation, met or exceeded the expectations, or nearly met. So it gives them an indicator of where they were. The other interesting bit of this information is it can provide teachers with a wealth of information. This can kind of get us to hone in on parts of our curriculum to see to what extent our curriculum does a good job of supporting student learning in these areas, and then looking at how they did within the context of our curriculum assessments and how they did in these components. So it's an interesting bit of information that they provide. This graphic is just a real simple graphic that I wanted to throw in. I used this graphic when Dr. Thornton had asked me last year to present at Town Hall. And it's just a really quick, easy way of understanding that we've gone from grade level expectations with NECAP to Common Core standards. Okay, and that means, in simple terms, that rigor has gone up. Children are being asked to do more rigorous content at an earlier age. And this graphic just simply shows that as rigor increases, there's an inverse relationship in achievement. Simply, the easier something is, the easier it is to achieve a higher level of proficiency, and then the harder something is, the more difficult it is. In the next slide, what I think all of our goal as educators is to change that trajectory. We have to find that sort of point of inertia and find that point for each individual child on how to get them to not only live up to the rigor, but also go beyond that. So here's the start of the data. And I chose to show the data in a very specific way, and I'll explain why in a few minutes. The first data set looks at our data, Cumberland's English language arts data overall. In this particular pie graph, roughly 43% of our population met or exceeded the standards, 13% not meet, 17% were partially met, and 27% approach. And I'm going to talk a little bit about these two pieces a little bit later on. I shift over to math, again, Cumberland data overall. 37%, we saw a little bit lower math scores overall in Cumberland, 37%. 9% not met, 23% partially met, and 31% approached. So the next slide, what I wanted to do is start comparisons. So how did we do in comparison to state scores? Okay, and there's, again, a ton of comparisons that we could do, but this is what I chose to show. So in math specifically, we were higher, 37 as opposed to 25% in terms of the met or exceeded as compared to the state. 9% as compared to 17%, so a higher percentage of students did not meet at the state level as opposed to our performance. Partially 29 at the state level to our 23, and approached 29 to 31. There's a close comparison there. Bless you. In ELA, again, staying with the same format, pie graph, ELA state versus Cumberland, we see that Cumberland did outperform the met or exceeded portion of the state, 43 to 36. We had a lower percentage of students that did not meet in comparison to the state. 17% partially to 20%, and virtually, again, statistically very close in the approached category, which I find interesting. So then what I wanted to do is I wanted to figure out a way to share the school data in a way that we could look at all of the schools together rather than looking at them in isolation so that we can compare results quite readily and efficiently. So this particular slide, I took the elementary schools that met or exceeded proficiency in mathematics. And we can see our 5 elementary schools. Community was at 66%, followed by Cumberland Hill at 54%, only separated by 1 percentage point, Ashton, Garvin then at 45%, and BF Norton at 37%. Keeping in mind that the number total of students that are testing, the difference in those percentage points in some cases could be just a small number of students, okay, that can impact a percentage point as you see there. Then I took the secondary schools, same thing, meeting and exceeding proficiency in math. We saw 42% at North Cumberland Middle School, 24% meeting and exceeding at McCourt, and 7% at the high school level. So then I went into ELA. Again, staying consistent with the categories and how I show the graphics. Community school was 48% proficient in ELA. Cumberland Hill was 54% proficient. Ashton, 55%. BF Norton, 35%, and Garvin, 39%. I looked at these slides and comparing the data for hours and hours and hours. So, I double and triple checked it, but of course, anything is subject to error. But I did edit it quite a few times. After a while, all the data and the numbers look the same. So I apologize. But secondary schools, meeting and exceeding proficiency in ELA specifically. Cumberland High School was at 32%. McCourt Middle School at 29%. And North Cumberland came in at a 49% proficiency rate in English language arts. So then I wanted to say, okay, so we've talked about the percent that met, but I think it's really important to talk about the percentage that did not meet, which is an encouraging part of our scores. You typically want that number to be, definitely less than 10%. I always think of, when I think about scores and when we look at response to intervention and students, you always want to see, typically they call it an 80-10-10 rule, where you have 80% of the population performing, think of the bell curve, 10% that sort of need a little bit of assistance, and then you have the students who really, really struggle. So that 80-10-10 rule is that typical rule of thumb, and we see that at the elementary level in math, the percentages of students that did not meet were relatively low, which is encouraging. It's encouraging. At the secondary level, we still see 5% at North, 13% at McCourt, hovering that sort of 10% range, and then we have Cumberland High School at 23%.
Just a quick question. So it's 80-10-10, so 80% passes, and you've got 20% that doesn't?
Well, it's more about 80%. The typical rule is about sort of 80% of the population should typically be able to take on core instruction, and perform at an average level or better. And then 10% of the population may be sort of like tier 2, needs some additional support. And then there's that tier 3%, which is typically around that 10% of the population. Is that a little bit more clear?
Yeah.
Okay. So then I give the same data in the percent not meeting proficiency in ELA as opposed to math. And again, we see some encouraging lower scores. Community was at 4%, Ashton 5%, Cumberland Hill 8%, Garvin 8%, and BF Norton 13%. In the secondary level, 19% at McCourt, 13% at North, and 28% at Cumberland High School. So I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, is that a misprint? Because it says math and it says ELA.
Where does it say math?
Not math, right? Yeah.
Probably a misprint. It might have been, yeah. I apologize. So now what I wanted to do is say, all right, so we've looked at the students who were proficient in meeting. Then we took a look at the students who did not meet. So what about what happens sort of in the middle. And I tend to think of things in a standard curve model. It's just the way I think. So what I found interesting, and I just wanted to share, is, and I wanted to just show it graphically, is if you kind of think of the belly of the bell curve. What I did was I took each elementary school and I took, let's say, I took ELA, for example, and in math, and I combined the partial and approaching scores, okay, their percentages. And at Ashton, what that combined number is 39% of the population in ELA and 41% of the population at Ashton in math were either partially or approaching. So a large segment of the population, and there's a correlation there, there's close numbers in both ELA and math. And then I did the same thing across all the elementary schools. At BF Norton, still very close numbers, 52% either partially achieving the standard or approaching, as opposed to 58% in mathematics. Garvin, we see the same trend, a 53-52 split. Cumberland Hill, 44-40, and community, 32-31. So as I looked at the whole data set, I just found it interesting that a large segment in either ELA or math had this large population of students that, were in the neighborhood. Were able to perform on some level within those Common Core state standard assessments on a decent level. So then I did the same thing for the secondary level. And I said, all right, I want to see if that same belly sort of exists. And when I looked at it, again, we see the same trends. It's a large population. At the high school, 41 ELA, 70% math, 51% at McCourt Middle School in ELA, and 63% in math. And then at North, we see a 47-54% split. So again, I just found that interesting data to share, and just it's another way of sharing. I think what's encouraging is we have a large segment of students that we can move. We can move towards meeting expectations. So then I wanted to also share the Algebra 1 and geometry percentages. And what I did was I took Algebra 1 and I did the state comparison all in one. So I did Algebra 1 Cumberland with the Algebra 1 state. So Algebra 1 in Cumberland was 35% proficient as opposed to 25% Algebra 1 at the state level. And then I took the geometry statistics, 9% proficient, and at the state level it was 14%.
So I understood that we had algebra for students who had taken it in middle school, and then we had algebra for students who've taken it at high school level. Have we broken that data down at all to figure out why there was such a difference in the score comparison?
If you don't mind, I'd like to, Alan, did you do an analysis on that particular
Well, I
segment?
can just tell you what it is. We knew it was the whole state knew it was coming. All your high achieving math students take it in 8th grade because it's based on the name of the course now, and your more low achieving math students are taking it in 9th grade. So and I don't know if you broke out the 8th grade math, but the 8th grade math students that are not currently are Algebra 1 students, they were 0% proficient from McCourt, and maybe 11% at North. And so 11% of students that were proficient in 8th grade math are now our Algebra 1 students. In a 7-month period, we need to take 89% of those kids and bring them to proficiency in Algebra 1, even though they were nowhere close to proficiency in grade 8 math. So that's our challenge as a high school. And so the state is looking at other factors for high school to give them some type of credit. We've tripled the amount of AP calculus students that earn a 3+ on the AP test, and we have so many other items for our higher achieving math students. But they knew they were going to have to accomplish something else because of what happened with the scores really being attached to the middle school stuff.
So just so I understand, so if Mr. Denon is an 8th grade student and he takes algebra, and I don't, and we move up to the next grade and are ready for our exams, I would take it as I'm taking algebra as a 9th grader, and then I get the assessment that year?
Yes.
So
You only
You
get
treat it
it,
as
you
an
only
eighth
get it
grade.
when you're in the course named Algebra 1.
So I'm presently in Algebra 1 and I have to take the Park exam?
Yes.
I don't know which grade you're in. Even though-
Right, and so, you know, what's not on the table, when you start comparing to other schools, are there kids that are in pre-algebra and not taking algebra and hidden from those scores? Are there, so there's a lot that goes into when we start comparing from school to school, but the basic answers are more low achieving math students are grouped together taking that in 9th grade.
But they had no exposure to algebra. They've had this much exposure at that point.
Well, they'll have 7 months from the beginning of school until the testing begins.
Which is the same as the 8th grade. If they have the same 8th graders have the same amount of exposure to algebra.
Absolutely, yeah. But consider the starting point for our 9th grade, which is 89% of them are not proficient in 8th grade math. And so, and that's to say, are they just 1 year behind, 2 or 3? So that's it. That's an interesting part of it.
Mr. DeMonico.
Are we able to look at the scores of those children from North Cumberland versus McCourt and see where that divide is, who's passing and who's not? I mean, I'm looking at a lot of red, greens, purples, and blues, and we got those same things in achievement from every school about kids in the reds need more interventionists, and are we able to break those numbers down from school children and school to give us a better idea of where our services should be sent to?
If I'm understanding your question correctly, I think you're referring to some STAR data that is shared during some of the committee meetings in terms of providing services versus the statistics that we're seeing on this assessment. And those are two very different things. And one of the things, just in a general sense, that we're noticing, or that I've noticed, is that there is not a correlation in a general sense between the number of students who are, say, benchmark on a given STAR assessment to the percent proficient on a PARC assessment in any given grade level. You know, typically, you may see in a 4th or 5th grade class, you know, an 80 or 90% benchmark rate, and that really speaks to a child's readiness to start to apply higher level skills versus an actual application of higher level skills on a proficiency assessment to the standards. So it's a little different. But to go a little bit deeper into your question, could we tease that information out if we want it from PARC? Yes, we could.
But can I also just say that, but the general answer is even in kneecap scores, even though we hit all our annual measurable objectives except for one in the previous year, the one that we did not hit was math economically disadvantaged. And so the scores that you see there, even with Norton and everything else, do fall along socioeconomic lines, subgroup lines, and I mean, you see it across the state and in the scores that you see here.
One also thing I'd like to note is, again, we could go a mile deep with some of the data that's out there. There are statistics on each individual category. When I had showed you that ELA had 5 components and math had 4 components, it actually gives us the school scores in each one of those components in terms of percentages. I mean, we can go on for quite a bit. You know, we could have easily had 60, 70 slides here, and I just wanted to give a broad overview and scope. But yeah, just like Alan said, you know, we do see those trends.
And Mr. Denon had a question.
Yeah, I know we're using STAR assessments to figure out whether intervention is needed. How are we using PARC results? I mean, what are we doing with the students who get 1, 2, or 3?
So that's a great question, and what I do at the end of the presentation, I have some action steps as to what we can do moving forward. I have some ideas about what we need to do.
Does that mean we're not doing anything yet?
I think individual buildings are looking at their scores. It's part of the principal's goal. So when they had to present their sort of objectives to Superintendent Mitchell, part of their school-wide goals are connected to improving PARC scores. So to say specifically what's going on in their schools, they're paying attention to the data, but I have some ideas that need to happen, I think, across all grade levels. So individual principals may be addressing their own building needs, but I think there are some larger things that need to happen across the district in terms of how we look systemically at approaching improving our curriculum and aligning it to some of this PARC stuff.
Yeah, I'm just, actually, I'll let you get your conclusion, then I'll ask.
Sure. Thank you. So in Algebra 1 and Geometry, again, I wanted to show that segment or that belly partial and approaching. 48% of students in Algebra were partial and approaching, and 74% in Geometry were either partial or approaching. You can go ahead, Phil. Thank you. So some conclusions are rather obvious. The slides that you have may have been PDF'd, and I did add 5 and 6 to this as I thought about things more and start pacing around in my office. I thought about these last 2 things, so I wanted to add these 2 things. But I'll start at the top. You know, we are encouraged, I mentioned this earlier, about the small number of students that are significantly below standard across all schools in both ELA and math. That's a conclusion that I would draw. We see trends of a large percentage of students across the schools who are on the verge of meeting grade level proficiency, given those belly statistics that I showed you. We have curricular gaps that will be addressed in both ELA and math. I think it's safe to say that, you know, when you have programs of study, and we sort of have this, for lack of a better term, this arms race by companies who want to put out a product, and you have these programs that we put in place that say we're aligned to the core, but no one really knows to the extent until you start to look at student performance, right? So our curriculum, again, I think in terms of X and Y algebraically, if our curriculum X gave us Y product, then, and we know that our curriculum has given this, then we have to conclude that if we don't make any changes, then there's going to be a very small degree of variance in our scores moving forward. And to not need to look at our curriculum in depth and to make some, changes in terms of plugging those gaps, then we're not going to see elevated changes. That would be my hypothesis on that. Number 4, the baseline data provides an opportunity for understanding where we are and where we need to go. And it goes back to, on number 4, what I really mean by that is if you go to the 5 components in ELA and those 4 components in math, right? It's really about doing an analysis of how well our curriculum addresses those 9 components, right? And to what depth they address those 9 components, and how well we are assessing those 9 components. Do we have forecasting assessments that show us or that can help us predict how well students will do on a PARC assessment like this, okay? I just wanted to footnote that 102 students, I asked Mrs. Shabbat today if she could provide me this in my little walking around my office that I was doing. So she told me 102 students were opt-outs last year. We have already received a number this year. I know that we've been receiving emails on that. And then I wanted to just briefly mention testing variables. We can't forget about there are certain variables that went into play, and I can speak specifically from BF Norton. We had a lot of technological glitches. Our IT team was actually phenomenal. They were on site. Jamie worked with BF Norton intimately. We were running around with walkie-talkies and figuring out problems. I mean, our 4th grade scores in particular at BF Norton were in particularly low in math, and we were a little worried about that. And in 4th grade, we had an hour's worth of troubleshooting during testing time where kids had to sit idle. And I know that there were problems across the district. I can't speak to actual time intervals, but I do know that there were widespread technological glitches on the Pearson platform for PARC, not because of our own insufficiencies in supporting the testing. So those factors, I mean, do contribute. When students have to sit idle and you start an assessment, all of a sudden everything goes, stops on you and freezes, and you're booting computers and you're running all over the place, and it just creates kind of a hectic environment, and not one necessarily that's conducive to a calm state, which when you should be testing, you should be, in a calm state. So I just wanted to bring that up as a conclusion. Moving forward, and this is the last slide, some action steps. I mentioned number 1, administrators have outlined PARC proficiency growth as personal school-wide goals. 2, I really think that curriculum mapping, this goes back to what I provided in the superintendent's report, an analysis of what we teach and how deeply we're teaching those enduring concepts. Because Park is really about doing things at a very high Bloom's taxonomy level. You know, you're talking about analysis and synthesis. When you're looking at STAR reports, it's really, again, about skill readiness. Do they have the basic foundational skills to be ready to take on some of those more complex tasks? And mapping is going to say, all right, so what is it that we teach and what do we have to fix here? You know, are our assessments good enough? Is our curriculum really good enough to prepare the students to the manner with which we need them to be prepared? I put on here, audit our assessment system. I really want to look in depth at our assessment infrastructure internally. That's a big undertaking, but I think one that can prove valuable. Do we have accurate assessment that forecasts grade level proficiency appropriately? That's an I wonder question. And when you're talking about, you know, an entire district worth of assessments, that's a lot, right? Because you're talking about formative assessment, summative assessment, and so on and so forth across lots of different content areas. Cross-referencing release Park items with curricular framework. Do they align? What needs to be added? What should we spend more time teaching? Time is a valuable resource. So when we curriculum map, what that allows us to do is when we audit, say, we have a 120-minute interval of time where we're teaching ELA. Are there opportunities when we curriculum map that we can shave 20 minutes of instructional time here and 20 here, and create more opportunities for science instruction or integrated literacy and science instruction that gets to more of that analysis piece? So those are all things that are going to come up organically as we go through this process. Do you have a question?
Me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Keep going.
All right. Kind of using up all my material here. I hope I have enough to answer a question. Implementation of those curricular shifts. So another big piece of this, it's one thing to identify it, it's another thing to come up with a plan to implement these shifts across grade levels, across in professional development, and the time that goes into doing that. So there's a magnitude there. What instructional shifts must occur as a result? So when you have curricular shifts, then that means that there are instructional shifts in terms of their approach and how that impacts teachers. So that's just another added layer that we have to look at. You know, Alan has talked a lot about this, and I'll have him sort of, you know, talk a little bit about efforts at the high school level to motivate and make Park meaningful to those students, you know, making it count, so to speak. You know, he's talked a lot about that. I don't know if you have any comments that you want to make around that, Alan. I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but, you know, you've mentioned, you know, it's difficult.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of ideas, and we're trying. I mean, the opt-out culture, testing fatigue, all those things played out in very different ways, in a lot of different schools, and you know, when the state backed off the graduation requirements counting and continued to back off. In our school culture, we had a petition against AP testing for the first time in 3 years that went along with this, and that resulted in so many kids really not putting forth their best effort. I mean, we had 94% participation, 95%, but the quality of that participation was horrible. And so we're working at some carrots for kids, but you know, how to really get that intrinsic motivation to really do well here. But we're trying to talk to kids about the idea of the school profile and how a quality school profile impacts them moving forward into college, how unfortunately these type of scores are linked to things like home prices and magazines and different groups that rate schools on these ridiculous rankings. And so we're trying to have those conversations with kids, and I'm going to go into every single classroom that's testing and have these conversations and basically beg. But it's definitely it's a real struggle. It's a real challenge. I think it'll get better over time.
Thank you.
We were trying to figure out how long some of the kids actually took the test, and we know that some kids were spending less than 10 minutes in taking the test. We also know, especially at the high school level, that in math, that it was very cumbersome to do this test electronically, and a lot of kids ran out of time and weren't able to answer all the questions. So they could have performed higher if they had the ability to spend more time and getting their answers down. So we know that too. That's a test.
Okay, and the last item that I have on here is, and Dr. Santa and I were actually having a conversation about this today, is sort of taking a look at auditing our intervention infrastructure and is it efficient? So when you curriculum map, you're really looking at your tier 1, your core instruction, right? And maybe the deficiencies within that. When you're talking about intervention, you're looking at that tier 2 infrastructure. So when students start to struggle, do we have a infrastructure in place that's actually efficient? Is it moving kids? Are we getting kids to respond to whatever those interventions are and get them back at a point where they're taking on that core instruction at a consistent level? Does that make sense? So that's in and of itself a huge job because, again, you have to have systems around these things for them to function consistently across the district, and there needs to be, consensus on what that infrastructure and that system looks like. And I've started to pull some data on that from principals just recently. So those are my action steps. There are 8 big ones, certainly deep ones, but things that excite me because it's exciting work when you can dive into this type of work and positively impact student lives.
I'm sure we have some questions. All right, who wants to start? Mrs. Tim?
I just have some general takeaways, sort of achievement, that there's definitely a disconnect between our assessments and what we're seeing in Park. There's a disconnect between how well we think the kids are doing in elementary school and then as they transition to the middle school, and definitely as they transition to middle school, are they really ready for high school level work? Because in the presentations where I would expect the kids to be and where they actually are in Park is very different. I would think that there needs to be a discussion as to whether or not we should be doing Park on computers, that maybe that's not the best way for these kids to take the tests, especially at the younger ages, that they spend way too much time worrying about whether or not they can hit the appropriate keys and not so much about what they know and how well they can do on the tests. It seems like somewhat that our assessments are telling us that our kids have the skills, but they don't have, we're not giving them the higher level thinking skills. We still are good at giving them like content skills. I don't know exactly how to explain it, but we're not how to take what they know and apply it, which is more what Park is trying to get them to be assessed at, is using information. And at the high school level, for kids that are sort of, I get it, not too psyched about taking an exam, I will say that I think preparing for Park and doing well in Park prepares you, because we're trying to get more kids to take the SAT. They're both standards-based. The SAT is definitely becoming more reflective of what we're trying kids to accomplish at Park. There is a connection between the two, that if you can do well in Park and be prepared for it, then you should see the results on your SAT. And at some point, I have to believe that these tests are going to count. I mean, we are trying to sort of create these benchmarks for students of whether or not a high school diploma is valuable. And I would expect that if the nation is coming together and deciding Park is sort of our assessment of the basic skills we think high school students should have as they exit the system, that yes, eventually, yeah, these are going to count. And again, they have a direct correlation to other tests that these students are taking that are all driving towards standards-based, that if they're going to go to community school or a 4-year degree or a GED or even going into the military, all of those tests have changed to more reflect what's going on in Park. And it is important that they do well and that they understand it's important that they do well.
Can I make a comment just to that? Because some of you weren't at the subcommittee meeting, and I think that's an important point when you mentioned something like the SAT. If we were to look just at these scores, and particularly in a year where the validity, reliability of them is suspect because of the level of true participation that we have. But when Mrs. Bolio talked about a dashboard, and so when we look at the dashboard of college and career readiness at Cumberland High School, 90% of our graduates come back for the second year of college. 266 tests earned college credit on AP exams last year. When you look at our top 120 students, which might be the size of some private schools that are out there, our math scores were just below 600 average for that top 120 students. So when you look at the entire dashboard of what we're doing, the 90% graduation rate, and all these other facts and data that you see, it's really this anomaly, and I think this these scores will certainly improve for somewhere like the high school. And to sound the alarm and to say that we need this dramatic change, or what people are working right now, and this thought and energy that's gone into a standards-based system and developing these comprehensive assessments, we're really in the first year of truly instructing to those assessments, and say we need this dramatic shift. I think that's sort of the wrong message, and not the one I try to give my faculty. I think we're headed in the right direction. When you look at so many of the indicators at this high school is serving kids extremely well, and will continue to do so. And ultimately, as it counts more, or maybe it becomes a graduation requirement, we're going to see scores come up here too on this indicator, this one indicator of many at the high school. So I just think that's an important point. A lot of the work that's being done, and as we know, with all the good work that's being done K through 12, 5 to 7 years is what it takes for sustainable change. And I think we're at the beginning, an emerging state of a lot of that. We're going to continue to tweak and continue to continually improve, because there are things here that we need to look at. But I think we are headed as a district, and especially high school, in the right direction.
And I do agree. I think that dashboard will help the community to have better understanding of all the good work that is taking place, so that you don't have sort of this incredible response to one indicator that isn't as good as you would hope it would be. And it also helps you stay focused on the long term of that you are making adjustments and you're getting the results that you need. And sometimes you just have a bad test, just like sometimes students have a bad test. But I do think you can use the data that you're digging through to figure out where are gaps and do we need to do more at helping kids to use more high-level thinking skills, because that does seem to be an issue at this point. So thank you for the data.
Mr. Fierro, do you have anything right now? I'll work my way down. Mr. Duffy?
So I have a few different things. One, when I was looking at there's a few different slides, so I'll start at like slide 13 when it's talking about the proficiency in the elementary schools. So what I saw was a trend starting there that we show a 30% difference between BF in math and community at 66%. And this trend continues on, and when we look at ELA, there's a 20% difference with BF being lower than Ashton and Cumberland Hill. And if we look at the middle school as well, so if we look at McCourt Middle School, there's a 20%, they're 20% lower than North Cumberland in math, and they're 20% lower in ELA as well. McCourt is to North Cumberland Middle School. So, I mean, all our curriculum is aligned across the district at this point, right? So, I guess in your conclusions or in your next steps, nowhere did I see it reference the socioeconomic lines, or everything is aligned here. What do we need to do? Because it's a clear pattern that if it's starting at the elementary levels and it's moving up as well, or wherever it is, that it seems clear that it's not just an issue with the curriculum at this point, or aligning our curriculum. We also have some issues going on with the individual schools. So with that, I would ask, so when we get extra money for students who are on free and reduced lunch, right? When that comes into our system, it's a question I'm going to ask, I don't know, but I believe when we get that extra money in, it just comes into our big pot of money, right? So when we get that extra money for those students, it's because there's an assumption that they're going to need more services, that these students may need more services, and yet we're not taking that extra funds we get for those students on free and reduced lunch and putting those into these schools with our social and economic issues at this point. I'm generalizing to a point, but I don't think that we're the money isn't following the child, the free and reduced child, back into those socioeconomic issues, I guess what I'm raising. And as a committee or myself, I think that we may, looking at these differences, when I'm looking at a 20% difference, I think maybe we have to try to look at, do we need to ensure that that money that comes along with that free and reduced lunch gets to the proper schools and the proper students, if that will help bridge some of this gap.
So I can just say that I think if you looked at some of the older insight data that talked about schools and how your spending was in specific schools, it did show that we did, at that time, contribute more to students that had higher proportions of ESL as well as free and reduced price lunch. So you did see community had the least per pupil versus BF Norton, which would have had the most per pupil. One of the things the General Assembly is proposing now is that you COA data break it down by school-based. So you can do things like that. We can certainly look at our budget sheet and figure out, you've got 400 kids at this school, what does their per pupil end amount to? But I think it goes to the bigger problem. And the bigger problem is the resources aren't going to the students first. They're going to the other expenses. And then what's left gets divvied up. And does it get divvied up so that that 1.4% or 1,040% goes to that student who has the free and reduced price lunch and 100% goes to the student who doesn't? That I don't think we have that answer to. But I do think as you talked about it, I'm thinking, I know it used to be disproportionate amount of money, it wasn't the same dollars. However, I don't think we have that finite availability of information for you, Paula, but it's troubling to me that what gets paid first isn't what benefits students.
So just to follow up, I guess I see a trend, and I would like us to at least look into what is our per pupil per stool to ensure that the extra money that's coming in specifically for those students is there to help those students. But I would also ask the administration to look at this. Is there a way that we can address this trend that we've seen in the socioeconomic? I know it's not a new trend, it's something we've had, but I think that on the takeaways, we can't look the other way. I think that we have to look at this and see, is there a strategy that we may be able to employ to try to bridge those gaps between those the different schools?
If I may, I just have two quick points. One is I referenced the intervention efficiency, right? When we talk about struggling students, we have to look at our intervention systems and how efficient they are in helping to remediate students to get them back to where they're able to access that core content, right? The other issue that we talk about, and typically your economically disadvantaged communities, you have high transiency rates, and we've had those conversations about how transiency can be it's a crippling effect on your curriculum and your infrastructure. You have students who are coming in from different communities, wherever they may be coming from, and they have, their curriculum, and then they come in and they have to sort of hit the ground running with our curriculum, regardless of what they were getting somewhere else. And I think at BF, we had somewhere in the neighborhood of it was close to 80-something students last year in terms of transiency rates. That's a grade level worth of students. And you have to learn their profile. You have to understand where they are. You've got to hit the ground running with them and get them to a point where they're able to meet proficiency. Yet those scores are reflected in our scores. So it's definitely something that we have to look at more closely. But it also is certainly something that that transiency rate is a variable that we can't control.
So to Mr. Duffy's question around that, if we look at our report cards, so our report card is one of the indicators, right, might be on your dashboard, is that student proficient based on what we know, and we may do a little deeper dive inside and say we're not really addressing certain content area needs, right, so we might want to adjust our program because we've got a gap. But if we know, we could say, we look at 5 pieces of information and that student is not proficient in whatever we decide is important, do we look at areas where they are remanded to, repeating content. Again, they might be proficient in math, but they may not be proficient in some other area. And as Mr. Tenrero said, you've got kids coming in, taking an algebra exam, and they have Swiss cheese holes in their program. So why aren't we looking, can we look at that program and say, oh, I see what it is. You didn't get this standard. You need some work so that you can create this flexibility in our program such that if kids are coming in or if kids continue to struggle, we're not pushing them through that box in 8 years, regardless of whether or not they're ready to hit high school. To me, it seems like we've got an issue and we can try and address it in a 6-hour day, and I think we continue to work on that. But if we really need something else, we should start modeling that as a kind of a subset of our program, because what we're doing isn't working for all students.
Fair statement. I think in a pure sense, in a pure standards-based world, when I say pure, I mean, there are varying degrees of educational models in terms of what is standards-based, right? You have, standards-based programs where students are able to, in different systems across the country, where they can move along and they've absolved, grade levels, and they kind of move along the standards and that's really, standards-based in its pure sense. Then you have a model that we have where we say each grade level is aligned to the standards, and students sort of move through that continuum, and then we talk about, well, one of the components of standards-based is multiple opportunities to achieve the standard, right? Each child should have multiple opportunities to achieve that standard. So then we have to look at, okay, do we have an infrastructure systemically in terms of our timetable in a day to provide that multiple opportunities, and where are those boundaries, and how many opportunities? So those are all conversations that we need to have, because we can say that we want to do it, and then we have to figure out, all right, do we have the infrastructure, do teachers have the infrastructure to support that? Because an elementary teacher teaches many content areas. So between science and math, ELA, how do they give students multiple opportunities to achieve a standard, yet continue exposing them to new content and moving on that continuum without having a backlog? Because again, they are responsible for teaching many content areas versus a secondary teacher who may, just have that one content with, 80 or 90 students on their caseload, whatever that case may be.
I'd like that to be one of the outcomes. As we dig a little deeper into the factory model, whatever it was, is it the agrarian model? It doesn't work for all students, so how do you make it work such that more students can be successful in our program? And I would love that as one of the bigger picture conversations. And the other thing I would ask is, there are some action steps, but let's put a resource and a time around it. So if we need 100 people to do it, I want to know that. And if we are going to get it done in 2 months or 6 months, and it'll be in implementation, because, and we've talked about this 100 times, you hate having to wait until next September, because if it's a whole group of kids that just miss out, it's our responsibility to ensure that they have that experience and that exposure. And if we can keep some of these pieces moving and on demand, I think, you got the hot potato, and unfortunately it's year 1 of Park and year 1 of Tony Demana. So, I think we always have this burning interest in conquering this, and I think we're progressive and flexible. We want to help you do it. So tell us what we need to do in order to get all students to be there.
It's a very innovative thing that you're actually saying, is that the framework is there with standards-based to move away from a factory model of grade level configuration and moving through that way, because we know we socially promote kids. It happens. Retention is a bad thing. But we could also promote kids and understand that each kid has a staggered learning profile, that they've mastered these competencies in these areas, but they still are having difficulties in these competencies. And they can be working in cluster groups and interventions at a 3rd grade level in those competencies, because that's where they're at. We're going to grow them to a 4.5 grade level by the end. So even summer school or extended school year time, you know, you think about those instead of making up all of Algebra 1, you really make up those competencies that you're still not proficient in. And it's a different way of thinking, and one that would take some time to restructure, but it's interesting.
It's looking more at mastery of learning versus just moving on, I think is what you're saying. And we would all agree with that, but how do you structure that and make that work? And then the other comment I'd have is yeah, we can do interventions. You can do interventions all day long, but they have to be the right interventions. And we need the right data with the right intervention. And I've known to say, you know, we can't give an antacid to someone who needs an appendectomy, and we can't give an appendectomy to someone who needs an antacid. We need to make sure that those things are aligned. So you saw the outcome of it determining what assessments we're using. We need to look at our data better to know this is a kid that really the issue, underlying issue, is decoding. In the special ed world, the underlying issue might be a processing disorder. You know, so it's being a little bit more prescriptive in what we provide for interventions for kids and creating the overall structure in which that works.
Mr. Dunn?
Just wanted to add, I like what you're saying, because rather than looking at the whole picture, you're looking at, you know, X% were proficient and X% were semi-proficient or almost proficient. It really comes down to the individual. And, you know, I don't see anything in the action steps about what we're doing for the students who got a 1 and how we're going to help them. You know, they took a test last year, they were in 5th grade, and they got a 1 on the test last year, and now they're in 6th grade, presumably. What are we doing to help them? And I think it actually works on both ends of the scale, too. We have students who were 5s, and what are we doing for them to make sure they're challenged?
I'm making a general statement and saying that, you know, if I go back to just taking a step back to kneecap, in terms of the ones, when I was at BF Norton, the percentage of students who were from a subgroup, 90% of the ones were from a subgroup in both language arts and math. And when I say subgroup, I mean either economically disadvantaged, ELL, and or IEP. Okay? So when I went into the ISS system, and Rachel will back me up on this, the data that's there is right now the economically disadvantaged data, the students with disabilities is inaccurate. So it's not indicative of what our numbers are in the schools in terms of the number of students who were economically, you know, and they're aware of that and they're working on that, but I don't have accurate data on that. I would venture to say that, you know, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that those students who, you know, are struggling typically and that are on IEPs is probably a high percentage of those ones who have specialized instruction and have service providers and case managers that are working with those students. But we can't lose sight of the fact that, again, we said, you know, if they were at kneecap performing at a 1 at grade level standard for, you know, Rhode Island's grade span expectations, now we've increased the rigor and are asking students to you know, interact with complex text at a higher rigor. Chances are the likelihood of those students remaining in that not meeting proficiency is very, very high. Mm-hmm. So we can't lose sight of that there has been an educational shift in rigor, and there are consequences to that. And we need to, we're not the only, you know, town, there are across the nation, whoever is adopting this Common Core has to deal with that issue.
Right, we move the standard from here to here.
Yeah, there's also even more complex issues where if we took the data and looked at all our subcategory kiddos, our free and reduced, our students under IEPs, as well as ELL, you would find a lot of the kids have hit the trifecta. That a lot of our most struggling students have all 3 components. They're all part of, it's very few that are just one subcategory. There's typical to have 2 or more subcategories, which is just another obstacle. Doesn't mean it's that we can't move the kids, we can. It's just more things that you have to wade through in order to get to the curriculum. We're spending a lot more time getting through social emotional issues, or we're getting through economic issues, the other issues, family issues, before we can actually even get to curriculum. So that's another.
And how many of those ones were transient that we received,
on top of
that were, you know, that were struggling in their other communities, and now, as Alan referred to, I have, you know, X amount of months to get this child to be proficient. You know, that's a challenge for us. So it's we could have all the plans in place that we want, but there are certain variables that make it quite difficult. And I would,
We have the ability, and have we done it, to look at the test scores for an individual student and say, you know what, this student is really proficient, but they got a 1, and try to figure out what went on there, or vice versa, they came out proficient and we didn't think they were. I don't know if that would happen.
schools receive the actual individual reports for students. One goes home to parents, one stays, and I think that's a practice that needs to become culturally consistent across all schools, that there is a cross-referencing of looking at those reports and cross-referencing that report with what they're seeing that's going on in their day-to-day instructional patterns and their assessment patterns. Yeah, that's definitely something that needs to be happening.
Thank you.
Mr. DeMonica, and then Mr. Fierro.
And Chair, I think our principals have done a good job coming in front of us in achievement and tell us what their needs are. And with the STAR assessments, they've really narrowed it down to the students that need the most work. But how do we get, as a school district, how do we get the services to those kids with the funds that we have? We have a problem, and it's called a funding problem, and trying to reach those kids. That's why I asked, can we identify the kids from McCord and North Cumberland that may need work at the high school? I remember years ago I brought that same information up as a president at that time about what are the needs, and we were told, oh, McCord would get more services. But are they getting the services that they need to, it's a divide, North Cumberland versus McCord divide, or North-South divide that's becoming socioeconomic that we see the problems, and how do we fix it?
That's a great question. I'm not so sure that it's necessarily always be throwing money at the issue or throwing capacity at the issue. I think a lot of it is systemic. Again, it goes back to systemically. I'll use the buzzword, okay, differentiation. We're talking about differentiation. How well are we differentiating for kids? How well are we tailoring the instruction? Do we really know a child's profile well enough to, during an intervention block or a differentiation block, are they getting that targeted instruction that they need, systemically? I want to look at that. We were talking about that. We have an intervention block for math and ELA. I like to think of it more of it as a differentiation block because my daughter may not necessarily need intervention. She may need some blended learning or some enrichment in another way. So it's really about differentiating for students, right? And do we have that system in place, and is it working consistently, or do we have pockets where we know it's happening well, pockets that it's not happening so well? And it boils down to, in some cases, expanding our capacity, but it's not always the answer. It's really about, in my opinion, building systems that work and having those systems widespread. And really what I want to do in coming in is looking at those systems broad scope. And I've been here a month, and I think that in this position, and I think that within that month, we're raising some very important questions that there's some exciting work ahead of us that we can answer some of those questions. I wish I had better responses for you this evening, but I can say that if we do look at those systems and improve them, like say a differentiation block, where it could equate to 200 minutes of instructional time in any given week. That's 40 minutes of instructional time, right, a day. Over the course of a week, that's 200 minutes, right? Over the course of a school year, how much instructional time is that? How well are we spending that time? That's the kind of stuff that we need to be paying attention to with the resources we already have, right?
Yeah, we're not going to solve the resource issue overnight, so we have to think creatively about what we're doing presently.
And it's about also being creative with other blocks, itinerant blocks that we have. How well are we utilizing those blocks? Library media block comes to mind. How well are we utilizing that time efficiently in terms of helping students prepare for, taking a test on a computer? How resourceful are they being in helping our students become resourceful? So those are all things that we need to improve the efficiency of that can help that trajectory rise.
Do we know of any other school districts that may have taken the test, written test versus the computer in Rhode Island?
In Rhode Island, I'm sure that there are. I don't, off the top of my head, know, but we can certainly look at those statistics. I have access to, all the different district statistics, and I can look into that. I read in a recent article. I think it was based in Illinois. I have some out-of-state stuff, but not not in-state. I can take a look at that, though.
Yeah, I know Mr. Duffy wrote the same numbers down. In Illinois, 43% who took it in pen and paper did better than the 36 that took it on the computer.
Yeah, it was roughly a 10% difference,
And
yes.
were our children able to, for instance, make up that 1 hour of time that they had to sit there and wait for the computers to come back up and running?
Yeah, so what the system does is so if it cuts out, it still allots the time frame for them to test out. So if it's a 90-minute test block and it cut out 2 minutes in, then the student still has 88 minutes of testing time to finish that test. A little late, I hope I got the math right. But to get that actual testing time in. So they don't lose that time. The time lost is momentum, and frustration and sort of, getting out of that rhythm. And now you have to do something with those kids for that hour, right? Because they expected to take the assessment.
Are those children able to multitask, using these computers and switching between reading and looking at a paragraph and, coming up with what
I'd
they
say
need to do?
you know what, it's quite difficult. And I'll just share a brief, adult comparison. When I was taking the superintendent's state exam for certification, it was an online test, okay? And I had to compare different documents and letters that were coming in and make an analysis and come up with a conclusion and an action model to respond to this. And I got through it, and it was difficult to navigate between all the different documents that they were giving me, right? Because you need to stay focused. You have to have a certain level of focus, concentration, plan it out, and say, all right, this is, and then respond in a meaningful way, right? So there's a lot of different skills that are going on there. And then I go to copy and paste, and 2.5, almost 3 hours into the assessment, and I go to paste, and guess what? Nothing pastes. Cut and paste. It was in the wrong spot or whatever. So I lost all my content. So then I had to go back and rethink everything. I wanted to literally leave the testing space because it was frustrating. But that's just one technological glitch that if you're not able to refocus and get in the game, some of these kids, in terms of their sustainability, when they get frustrated because they're reading complex text or they're doing a problem and they're on part B of C and they're stuck and they didn't get past part A, that persistence of staying in the game, those are all little things that we have to be mindful of when we're teaching our kids. Those are all things we don't typically think of when we're looking at these raw statistics.
We have another park test coming up in a couple months. Are we 100% locked into using computer for all of our students again this year?
That's a question for Superintendent Mitchell. That's my understanding that we are. I know that the state is making a move toward, I think it's in 2017, that everyone has to be computer-based testing. So I can't speak for Mr. Mitchell on that, but my assumption is that everyone will be testing with computer. I also have heard that paper testing is quite cumbersome, meaning there are tons and there's a huge cost to schools that take on that because there are something per child, it's like something like 50 copies. Don't quote me on that, but it was something like 50 copies of actual paper or something per child that tests. So there was like this enormous amount of paper. So I don't know if that went into decision making, but I was the principal at BF. I wasn't making decisions at that point, district wide. So.
I think part of the equation on the socioeconomic part, I think we have to do a better job of trying to have community outreach to help to put the parents into a position where they can help the kids succeed, because that is definitely a part of the problem, where there's a disconnect between what's happening at school and what's happening in the home. I think there's an opportunity to help those families be in a better position to help their children.
I have a question or a comment about resources, because a lot of what you're talking about is a lot of data analysis, and I'm just wondering, I look at you and I'm not sure the depth of your staff and sort of the skill set and access to just the software and the knowledge of how to do in-depth data analysis. How do you have time to take a look to drill down student by student? Are there resources that beyond interventionists and other positions that we're thinking of adding that we really need some data analysts?
I've had conversations with Superintendent Mitchell and Alex about some of these things in terms of, increasing, my capacity to be able to sort of project manage these things, and having lots of moving parts going at once, so that way we can get this stuff moving a lot quicker. Certainly, being one person, it's very difficult, especially when you're talking about, a span K-12 in a highly accountable educational world that we're in.
And has there ever been any discussion, are we able to tap into any of our graduate programs for students to do, to help set up? Once you set some of these systems and databases up and you program it correctly, the next year and the next year, it becomes easier and easier to do some of the analysis. But that whole initial startup that we need to go through to really drill down into this data that's a big undertaking to do it correctly and set those systems up correctly.
Yeah, I think one important piece of that too is the relationships too. So it's not only about the data analysis piece, it's about now how do we take those numbers and then create relationships and have that be a part of our culture, right? So whoever's doing that data analysis, how do they project manage and then go back and develop that relationship with the building administrators and help support them and then help support the teachers, so there's that intimacy of having a culture built where those people are also heavily involved in what's going on in the schools as well. So it's not just about that data analysis behind a computer and that technology, but it's making that connection on how do I work with Phil and help Phil in his building, and how do I help support their interventionists and teachers, right? It's that cycle, that system again.
Mr. Duffy?
Just quickly back on the computer versus the handwriting thing. So as you mentioned, Illinois they had, but also in Maryland it was 14 points higher if somebody took it on paper and pencil versus on the computer. So with that, I would guess, could you speak to the superintendent and ask him, even if we could have a certain subset or a certain group volunteer to do paper and pencil so we can do our own in-house survey. If it's not a requirement for graduation or at a certain level, let's test it ourselves. Maybe you take one classroom and you do paper and pencil. I understand even if it's 50 copies, but it's a small expense. If we could get 14 points higher on all of these across the board, I think that's money well spent for 50 copies.
It's not a problem, I'll certainly discuss
At least
it.
run it by him to see if there's a chance we might be able to do some
Some piloting
internal.
it.
Yeah,
Certainly.
thank you.
My concern with going down that path, though, is if you're getting forced
It ends.
into it
You're not gonna be able
2017,
It
you're
ends.
trying to get these kids to develop these skills, so in a few years, if this test does count more significantly, they've had practice to learn how to do the test online, or you're almost doing them a disservice if they have to do it online eventually.
He said, but and I understand that, and I agree, but at the same time, I think it's more data for us to go back to Park and say, clearly, doing it by paper and pencil and doing it on the computer are not equal. Whether they have to put that on some type of a scale, or you get more time if you do it on a computer, or something has to be different. If it's the exact same test on paper or on a computer, and they're scoring that much higher across the board in those two states, to me, Park has to look at that and figure that out. So to me, it's just data that we could give to them and say, look, it's happening here as well. But I agree, I don't want to do it for everyone, and we set this bar and then we go to computer and then we drop 10 points. But I'm just looking for a small group here to see what's it look like for us as well. That's all, thank you.
Mr. Fiorillo?
I know that you, and I believe Mrs. Teal and Mr. Denton were at the School Committee Association meeting when we talked about the park results. Didn't the presenter give us information about districts across the country that actually were the reverse, where their computer scores were actually higher than the paper scores? And did it have something to do with their familiarity with kids using the computers? Or familiarity with the children using the computers?
I'll defer to Mr. Durham.
Yeah, well, my memory was that she said it was inconclusive, and that some districts did better if they used paper, and some districts did better if they used computer. And she was not ready to say that one was better than the other in Rhode Island. But I think since then, we've seen some research into this, and it, what we were sent by Tim Duffy said that paper came out higher. Is that right?
Yeah, and also, it's interesting, like if you're sending your kid to school and their report cards are coming home, and let's say that we have a high degree of confidence in our report cards, and then they take the park test, because of the computer, we're kind of deflating their scores, so you're not necessarily giving an accurate representation. And it is the most public score we have, next to the SATs. And that, to me, is particularly troubling, because as we struggle and we are all really actively trying to help find a solution, the most concerning part is, it is front page headline, and additionally, what you're still going to see is park's going to be Rhode Island's park. We're not going to be able to, it's going to take a long time for us to be like, Cumberland is most like this school district and this school district, and so you could say we're competitive, or this school versus that school and we're competitive. I think that's going to take a long time, so we're going to take a lot more lumps, because we are in Rhode Island right now, and we have no really good way of kind of pulling ourselves out of that. Mr. Denon.
Mr. Demotic and I went to something this past weekend about graduation requirements in Rhode Island, and there was talk about students will still take the park exam, and there will be an exam required at some point in the future, starting in 2020, we think, for graduation, but it may not be park for all students. There'll be a whole menu of possibilities. It could be, you could choose to have the park be your exam,
yes.
SAT, or one of these other tests.
Yes, sir.
Just something to keep in mind.
Yes.
I would caution about having, going to a paper model. With the computerized model, we're able to provide easily 75 assistive tech accommodations for students that will help them to actually improve their scores. A lot of those were not available last year. So some of that is part of kind of the learning curve of the Pearson platform. And we're about ready to, with your support, we purchased assistive tech that is part of the Chromebooks, and our staff are being trained next week on utilizing that with students. So and some of those accommodations, you don't have to be in special ed, you don't have to have 504, you don't have to have anything special, you can just receive them. For instance, having the math problems read out loud to you versus you having to read them on your own. That's an accommodation that almost any student can receive if we think that's going to help them improve their performance. So I'd really caution diverting away from something that we're going to have to go to anyways in 2017. But.
Okay, just that secondary menu of options, it's really the same stuff we needed. They've changed the sequence, but classification, scoring, and the federal government's still going to require that all kids take one test for comparability and all that stuff. So, yeah, they can take the SAT now before the park, but what is that? Why would that student's then going to have to sit through 6 days of park after saying, I already have the SAT, I'm done. So what is that going to do to those scores too? So I just don't get it. The sequence is different, but like, what's the point?
You probably heard the same thing that we heard. When NECAP was a requirement, you had to fail NECAP twice before you could use an alternate assessment, and now they're changing that. Right? So you don't have to fail park before you can use something. You can say, I want to use the SAT as my assessment, but you still have to take the park. You're right. If you pass the SAT and then you have to take the park, you're not going to give you 100% potential.
Yes, it's just like a change of the sequence, but really the same thing that they were talking about.
Anyone else? Well, you're either going to sleep like a baby or your head's going to be spinning tonight. So I thank you for this presentation and appreciate all the efforts. And if, as we can tie resources and timelines into this, it would be great to see once we're finalizing some of that. Anyone else? Mrs. Vogel, I think you're up next. We won't have as many questions for you.
Go really, really slow for hours.
Okay. So, I have personnel recommendations for you today. I have one leave. So I request the advice and consent of the school committee on the FMLA leave of Christine Silva, secondary English teacher at Cumberland High School, with an anticipated leave date of April 11th, 2016 through the remainder of the school year.
Pleasure of the committee.
So moved, Madam Chair.
Motion by Mr. DeMonica, second by Mr. Denon. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? That motion carries 6-0.
Then I have a list of coaching appointments for you, so I'll just read the list off. So I request the advice and consent of the school committee on the following coaching appointments. Boys junior varsity track and field. This is a winter leftover. I apparently got left off by accident of the last, so I didn't want to not appoint him. So Jean Young. Boys varsity tennis, Kevin Hartman. Boys junior varsity tennis, Brandon Hanaway. Boys varsity lacrosse, Scott Carpenter. Boys junior varsity lacrosse, Brian Lawrence. Girls varsity lacrosse, Jessica Shield. Girls junior varsity lacrosse, Sherry Hurd. Boys varsity baseball, Andrew Tookin. Girls varsity softball, Martin Crowley. Boys varsity golf, James Dickinson. Boys varsity outdoor track, Thomas Kenwood. Girls varsity outdoor track, Vanessa Malloy. Girls junior varsity outdoor track, Josh Lima. Weight room supervisor, Gabriel Gonzalez. Boys baseball, North Cumberland Middle School, Stephen Cardozo. Boys baseball, McCourt Middle School, Brad Yankee. And girls softball, North Cumberland Middle School, John McDonald. So just before you vote, these are all returning coaches. None of them are new to us. And we do still have vacancies in girls junior varsity softball that we are working on filling, as well as McCourt's softball team, which I think Matt's pretty close to them.
Pleasure of the committee on the coaching appointments.
Motion to approve.
Motion by Mr. Fiorello. Second by Mr. Duffy. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion carries 6-0.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Vogel. All right, we have no executive session this evening, so Mr. Fiorello. Oh, sorry. I don't have my glasses on. All right, school committee comments. Thank you, Mr. Fiorello. Yep, you must have a comment. Mr. Duffy.
So just quickly, I was going to bring it up on the superintendent report, but I missed it. So I'm just wondering, do we have a plan for this weekend with the 7, 10 degree below temperature for the schools, as far as in the past we've either cranked up the heat or you have somebody monitoring? If you don't have an answer now, I would just ask, do we have a plan for this weekend? Because in the past, when it gets like this, we always have pipes burst, and I'm just wondering if it's something that's been addressed yet.
So, Alex, do you want to take that since you work with facilities?
Yeah, Will and I were talking about that today, and we're going to make sure that we have the buildings checked those nights.
Okay, so there'll be some type of roving, okay, thank you.
I don't know what it's going to be yet, we're going to talk about it, but
That's fine.
we've already talked about that. We want to make sure we have it checked, we have it covered.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else?
Motion to adjourn.
Thank you, Mr. Fiorello. Second by Mr. Dennett. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? And we are adjourned at 9:40. Thank you.
Just to,